Jesus dies. Oh boy. And normally that should be a massive problem for a Messianic movement. Your Messiah is supposed to bring redemption. Instead, Rome executes him. Yikes. What's up, everybody? How's it going today? I hope everyone is doing well out there. I know I am, for sure. But I got a question. And depending on what side of the conversation you're on, you might not like where this goes. Christians say Jesus is the Jewish Messiah. They say the Hebrew scriptures predicted him. They say he fulfilled prophecy. They say the entire story was pointing toward Jesus. All right, cool. But there's a pretty obvious question sitting right in the middle of all that, if you ask me. If Jesus is the Jewish Messiah, why don't Jews believe in him? Why don't Jews believe he is? And before someone runs to the comments, no, the answer ain't simply because the Jews rejected Jesus or God. That is the Christian theological answer. I'm looking for the historical answer. So I'm asking a historical question because Jesus was Jewish. His disciples were Jewish. The scriptures Christians say predicted Jesus came from the Jewish tradition. And the earliest Jesus movement started among Jews. So how do we get from a Jewish preacher with Jewish followers to Christianity becoming a separate religion where most of the followers aren't Jewish? That's what we're talking about today. And trust me, the story is way more complicated than what most of us have learned in church. What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the Jewish Skeptic. If you're new here, this channel is about questioning claims, examining evidence, and figuring out what we can actually demonstrate. No fear, no dogma, just clarity. That's my slogan here. And today we're talking about something I wish I understood better when I was a Christian, actually. Because when I was in the church, the story sounded pretty simple for the most part, you know. The Jews were waiting for the Messiah. Jesus showed up. Jesus fulfilled the prophecies. Some Jews rejected him. Christianity began. In the story. Except that's not really the whole story, because there's something important happening in the background that changes how you understand all of this. Here's the first thing we need to understand, folks. Judaism in the time of Jesus wasn't one giant group where everyone agreed about everything. Not even close. There were Pharisees, there were Sadducees, there were Essenes, Nazarenes, Ebionites. There were different teachers, different movements, different interpretations of Torah, different beliefs about resurrection, different ideas about religious authority, different relationships with Rome, and even different expectations about what God was actually going to do next. So when someone says the Jews believe the Messiah would, hold on, which Jews? Because that's where this gets interesting. We sometimes talk about ancient Judaism like everyone had the exact same theology, and they didn't. And that's important because there wasn't one universally agreed job description for the Messiah sitting around in first century Judea, y'all. Some Jewish expectations involved a Davidic king. Some were connected to national restoration. Some were apocalyptic. Some Jewish writings even imagine more than one messianic figure. The Dead Sea Scrolls, for example, contain expectations involving priestly and royal messianic figures. So the Jewish world that Jesus entered was already full of disagreement and interpretation. And then Jesus shows up right in the middle of it. Now, hold on. And this is why I want to be careful, because I'm not saying Judaism was divided, therefore Christianity is false. That doesn't follow. I'm saying Christianity didn't appear in a vacuum, folks. It emerged from an already diverse Jewish world. And once you understand that, the beginning of Christianity starts looking a lot less like everyone or everybody knew exactly what the Messiah was supposed to be and then randomly rejected him. And it starts to look a lot more like another Jewish movement emerged with its own interpretation of scripture and the Messiah. That's two different pictures, two very different pictures, y'all. Here's another thing that gets lost in these conversations. The Hebrew word behind Messiah basically means anointed one. And that title wasn't originally another word for God becomes a human being, dies for everybody's sins, and resurrects 3 days later. Kings can be anointed. Priests can be anointed. The Hebrew Bible even calls Cyrus, the Persian king, God's anointed. And Cyrus wasn't even Jewish. So when Christians hear Messiah, we're already hearing that word through 2,000 years of Christian theology. But an ancient Jew hearing Messiah or ancient one didn't automatically hear the second person of the Trinity. That's theology that developed within Christianity. And that's one of the biggest disconnects in this entire conversation. Christians and Jews can read some of the exact same scriptures, and they're not necessarily starting with the same assumptions about what those passages actually mean. So let's get directly to the question. Why doesn't Judaism accept Jesus as the Messiah? Well, there isn't one single answer for every Jewish person, but traditionally the biggest problem is pretty straightforward, if you ask me. From the Jewish perspective, the Messianic age hasn't happened. Look around, Is there universal peace? No. Have wars ended? No. Has humanity entered some worldwide age of the knowledge of God? No. Did Jesus restore the Davidic kingdom during his lifetime? No. And the temple, the opposite happened. A few decades after Jesus died, the Romans destroyed the second temple. Now, Christianity has an answer for this, and I want to represent that answer correctly. Christians generally say Jesus began the Messianic work through his death and resurrection, and he'll complete the rest when he returns. That's the second coming. And within Christianity, that makes sense. But Judaism doesn't generally accept that solution, because from the traditional Jewish perspective, if the promised Messianic transformation didn't happen, then the Messiah hasn't completed the job. That's the disagreement. Not Jews just didn't like Jesus. Not Jews were too stubborn to accept Jesus and God. The disagreement is over what the Messiah is supposed to accomplish and how the scriptures should be interpreted. Simply that. And here's the part that really fascinates me. Jesus dies. Oh boy. And normally that should be a massive problem for a Messianic movement. Your Messiah is supposed to bring redemption. Instead, Rome executes him. Yikes. So now the followers of Jesus have a problem. What does his death mean? this is where the interpretation becomes everything. His followers don't simply conclude, well, guess we had the wrong guy. They reinterpret what happened. His death becomes part of the plan. The suffering becomes meaningful. The resurrection becomes vindication. Scriptures are reread through the experiences of Jesus. And now the Messiah isn't simply the person who immediately restores Israel. He's the suffering and resurrected Messiah who will return later and finish the job. That is a huge theological development. And whether you believe that development came from God or from human beings trying to understand what happened, that's where the historical question gets real interesting. Now, bring back what we said earlier, when we were talking about them different Jewish groups when the episode first came on. There were already different Jewish groups interpreting their tradition differently. And now you've got another Jewish movement, the Jesus movement. At first, though, this isn't looking like the Christianity that we know today. It's a different Christianity. The earliest followers of Jesus were Jews. They're arguing about Jewish scripture. They're debating Jewish questions. They're trying to figure out what Jesus means within a Jewish framework, I guess that's what you can say. And here's where things really start moving. Gentiles begin joining the movement. Non-Jews, Gentiles. And now you've got a massive question. Do these Gentiles have to become Jews? Do the men have to be circumcised? Do they have to follow the Torah the same way? What exactly is required? And you can literally see these arguments happening inside the New Testament. Paul becomes extremely important here because his mission focuses heavily on Gentiles. And Paul's basic position is that Gentile followers of Jesus don't first have to become Jews in order to belong to the movement. Think about how important that is, because once you remove the requirement that somebody must essentially enter the Jewish covenant system first, you've opened this movement to the entire Roman world. And now something that began as a Jewish messianic movement can spread among people who aren't Jews at all. And this is how the split starts making sense. Well, at least to me, it does, And over time, the demographics change. The theology develops. The movement spreads throughout the Roman world. Jewish followers remain, but Gentiles become increasingly important. Then you've got the destruction of the temple in 70 CE. Judaism itself is adapting to a world without the temple. The Jesus movement is developing too, though, on the back burner. And over the following generations, the boundaries between Judaism and Christianity became increasingly defined. Eventually, Christianity isn't simply another Jewish group arguing with other Jewish groups. It's becoming a distinct religion. And that is why I think saying the Jews rejected Christianity actually hides the most interesting part of the story. Because Christianity started with Jews. Some Jews accepted Jesus. Most Jews didn't. The Gentiles increasingly did, though. And eventually, the branch that believed Jesus was the Messiah became overwhelmed with Gentiles and developed into Christianity. That is a much better historical explanation than the Jews just rejected their own Messiah. And here's where my skepticism comes in, because Christians will often say Jesus fulfilled the Jewish prophecies. Okay, but that's a claim and claims need to be examined. So don't just show me a verse in the Hebrew Bible, then show me a New Testament writer applying that verse to Jesus and tell me prophecy has been proven. Bro, I want to know, what did the passage originally mean? Who wrote it? Who was it written to? What was happening historically? Was it even considered a messianic prophecy before Christianity? Or are we reading Jesus backwards into the text because we already believe he's the Messiah? Those are two different questions, and asking them ain't disrespectful. That's what we're supposed to do when we're trying to figure out what's actually true. What I am not saying, and again, I'm not saying Jews don't believe Jesus is the Messiah, therefore Christianity is false. That is just another bad argument. Jewish people can be wrong. Christians can be wrong. I can be wrong. Everybody can be wrong. The question is, what does the evidence actually support? That's the question. And what I don't think we should do is pretend there is one obvious set of Jewish prophecies. Every Jew understood them exactly the same way. Jesus clearly checked every box, and then everyone just decided not to believe it. History is way messier than that, people. Sorry. So, why do Jews reject Jesus as the Messiah? Because Judaism and Christianity ultimately develop different understandings of what the Messiah is supposed to be and what the relevant scriptures mean. Duh. Traditional Judaism looks at the world and says the messianic redemption hasn't happened yet. But Christianity looks at Jesus and says it started with him and he'll finish it when he comes back. And those two interpretations lead to two very different religions. But here's what I find fascinating. Christianity didn't begin completely outside of Judaism. It began inside a diverse Jewish world with Jewish people arguing about Jewish scripture, trying to understand a Jewish teacher, making claims about a Jewish Messiah. And eventually, one of those movements became the largest religion on earth. So maybe the better question isn't simply, why did the Jews reject Jesus? Maybe the better question is, how did one Jewish interpretation of Jesus eventually become Christianity? And that might need to be the next episode. I'm CJ. This is the Jewish Skeptic. And remember, no fear, no dogma, just clarity. I'll see y'all on the next one.
Do you know what I found? The more you know, the less you know.